There were earlier this morning. It is a safety issue. We saw the safety as an issue on January the 6th, 2021, when the man at the centre of those events arrives here in 48 hours. One imagines we'll see more police officers, we'll see more safety barriers, because he is at the centre of a big political debate, a very angry debate, a debate that we've seen turn violent in this country, and the authorities here in the nation's capital are clearly mindful of that. They will be in 48 hours' time. They will be from here to the November 2024 election.
James, thank you very much indeed. Breathless stuff tonight, obviously. So hearing there from Jack Smith, Special Counsel. Just remind you are watching the press preview. We will show you the newspapers down the side of your screen, but lots to talk about. So let's rejoin former federal prosecutor David Weinstein. And worth remembering that any case will be heard in Democrat-leaning DC, obviously, with many of those who might be called to be jurors having a front row seat to what unfolded on January the 6th, 2021.
It will be. And, you know, that's where this all occurred. That's where it took place. That's why this indictment was presented to a grand jury in the District of Columbia, not because they were forum shopping, but because this is where it happened, as it was just described by a reporter standing there on the steps of the Capitol. This is where it happened, and this is where the trial in this matter will take place.
Interesting that 4 lawyers have also been named in this or included in this indictment. And I understand that Jack Smith's team appeared to be very interested in late night on the 18th of December back in 2020, a White House meeting that one aide described as unhinged, in which Trump's private lawyers suggested that he ordered the US military to start seizing state voting machines in an unprecedented effort to pursue his false claims of voter fraud. I mean, should this case come to trial, the details of issues like this will be intriguing and interesting.
Well, certainly. They've put this in the indictment. It's a very speaking indictment. These are overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. When you do that, jurors expect you to present that evidence. And so now they will present exactly that evidence. Will it be from people who were in the room? One presumes so, unless there are recordings that were made of those conversations. So many of the people who are named as co-conspirators in this indictment, it would seem to me that they've entered into some sort of agreement with the government. Either they've been given immunity in exchange for their testimony, or we will see documents filed shortly where they will agree to plead guilty to some of these charges and work with the government to work off whatever time they might be facing.
And Jack Smith drew our attention to what he called a bedrock function of US democracy, this certifying of the US election, you know, counting the votes and certifying it. We remember that day. It was the day it was supposed to happen. You know, Mike Pence was in the seat. The indictment says on the day of January the 6th, he attempted to exploit the chaos by pushing to delay the certification of the election results, even after the building was cleared of violent protesters. So right to the end, he continued to try to thwart the election result.
Exactly. That's the way they portrayed his actions in the indictment. So it's not just the statements he made during the assembly that took place prior to these people rushing into the Capitol building, which could have raised an issue as to free speech versus inciting a riot. There is no rioting charge that's contained in here as well, but rather they're using all of this information, all of this evidence to show his intent, that he did not intend to give up, that he intended to disrupt the election process to prevent the election from being certified. If supported by facts as presented not only to this grand jury, but to a jury who will decide this, those facts will be what convicts the former president.
David Weinstein, it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts there, former federal prosecutor. Let's bring in our guests then, Rachel Cunliffe and Henry Hill. What a night. Interestingly, I continue to read parts of this indictment. Trump's claims of having won the election said the indictment were false and the defendant knew they were false, but the defendant repeated and widely disseminated them anyway to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, to create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and to erode public faith in the administration of the election. So, Rachel, was this effectively a failed coup from somebody intent on staying in power?
That's certainly the implication of the indictment. It's really interesting. It draws a narrative thread through Donald Trump's behaviour all the way through from the days after the 2020 election, when he was claiming that there were fraudulent votes that were counted, that there were legitimate votes that were not counted, the Stop the Steal hashtag, the repeated claims that they were going to put in lots of lawsuits to show that the results that had been recorded were actually false and in his favour. All of that, all the way through to, we read about suggesting that perhaps the military could go in and seize voting machines, or asking if there were other things, ways to use the apparatus of government while he was still president to change the result or disrupt the process of handing power over from one person to the next. And then you've got the rally itself, where he knows that the people attending, many of them, are actually armed. He knows that the atmosphere is sort of very, very tense, and encourages them to sort of march on the Capitol. And his tweets throughout the rest of the day continue to encourage that kind of behaviour. We shouldn't forget that a lot of that anger, that violence, was aimed at Mike Pence, the Vice President, Donald Trump's running mate, who had been working very, very closely with him for the last sort of 4 years. So there are real questions here, not just about his attempt to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, but also about him turning on his running mate, the Republican Party itself, and indeed the idea of American democracy, in order to get his way however he could.
And in fact, the four-count indictment reveals new details about this chapter in American history, detailing handwritten notes from former Vice President Mike Pence about Trump's relentless goading, we're told, as well as how Trump sought to exploit the violence of the January the 6th day to remain in office, even after they'd left. But remember that election. In the run-up to the election, they started talking, even before the voting, about election fraud. You know, the seeds were being sown right the way up to polling day, Henry.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was Donald Trump's strategy. I think he knew that he was facing an uphill struggle in that election, and he feeds off this anger. As I said earlier, he uses it to scam people into paying for his legal fees. This is a millionaire, and he's got poor Americans in red states stumping up cash to pay for his legal defence. I think one of the few good things to come out of this is that America is strong enough that there was no coup. Donald Trump was a raving fantasist. He wanted all of this stuff to happen, but there is no suggestion that the armed forces, Mike Pence, as we say, his running mate, had nothing to do with it. There was the January 6th insurrection, but there was nothing resembling any kind of a US state collaborating with Donald Trump. The thing I thought was most ridiculous was that suggestion that the US, if he is convicted, the US prison service won't be able to find a place for him. He's not Dr. Octopus, right? Like, just put him somewhere. They put Napoleon on an island. Like, there must be somewhere that it would be such a bad signal if this man is indicted on charges this serious and then he walks out. Like, what signal does that send about the justice system? It's incredible.
Well, I continue to read the indictment. The indictment filed, as we know, just over an hour ago, says prosecutors said Trump and his unnamed co-conspirators knowingly made false claims of election fraud to convince officials in 7 battleground states, namely Arizona, Georgia, where it looks like he might face further charges, Michigan, where somebody else has faced charges actually today, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, to submit fraudulent slates of electors. Electors are those people appointed by state parties to certify the winner of the popular vote in their state. So they're heading for the electors in these states, these important people who pass on to Washington to allow that, that grand day where they count the votes and verify them, and it's a rubber stamping day, effectively. So what they're alleging is it goes right into the state level, this conspiracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the depressing thing is, if you know a lot about American democracy, is that actually, if you do want to skew an American election at state level, there are all kinds of ways that they do it all the time. State governments, state legislatures, they draw boundaries differently. They choose which officials get to count the votes and all the rest of it. So to have this sort of additional involvement, sort of ham-fisted involvement, calling for outright criminality from the Trump campaign is extraordinary, because it's so, in many respects, it's so unnecessary. There are so many ways in America that you can legally skew a vote. So it's just a sign of how desperate they were and how unthinking, because this was never going to work. Let's face it, there was not a universe in which this actually delivered a second term of Donald Trump's presidency. But what it has done is it has kept the MAGA movement going. It's given them a persecution narrative. We heard Donald Trump's absurd comparisons. You know, he's clearly, even though he's not on it anymore, spent too much time debating on Twitter, calling everything Hitler. But fundamentally, it served his political purposes. And if it gets him all the way through to November, extraordinary as that seems, then who are we to say that it wasn't a good strategy for him? It's mad.
Well, the indictment seems to suggest he tried to get fake electors, these people nominated by their states, and the indictment alleges that some fake electors were tricked and falsely led to believe that their votes would be used only if Trump was successful in his legal challenges in their state. So it sounds, you know, this is a detailed conspiracy now about that day of certification. We read on, and we'll have more after the break, and also a full look at tomorrow's newspapers as well. Don't go away.
It's a really concerning rise that we've seen. There's always been an issue around rural crime within the UK, but what we've seen certainly back part of last year, beginning of this, is an increase in theft, and particularly machinery and the types of the big stuff you see behind me here, going to Eastern Europe, stuff that's gone into Ukraine and to Russia. And it probably wouldn't come as any surprise if I say that, look, manufacturers can't sell to Russia and Ukraine at the moment, so the black market and criminals have monopolised on this, and we're seeing machinery going out to there, which is looking at the 20 to 30% rise we've seen for theft of agricultural and construction machinery in the first quarter of this year. This is very well organised crime. Look, to get a piece of kit like this, or even you've heard talk earlier of the GPS units being taken, it is very well organised. This is not opportunist. So yes, it is stuff that is being in demand. It's wanted out there. Ukraine and Russia have got some of the largest arable areas in the country. So this is important equipment for them. And like I said, the criminals have seen an opportunity to monopolise on this. But I think it's also something that I would emphasise is that whilst we're trying to tackle this, we're working very closely with the NFU. The NFU mutually very kindly helped